Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Astral Perceptions, a show dedicated to examining the outer fringes of our reality and bringing them to the forefront of our awareness. I'm your host, Mark Johnson, and I want to welcome everyone to our Halloween special. Ooh. Now, as most of you probably know, as I've spoken on my past shows on Paranormal UK Radio, I am a paranormal investigator. I've been investigating the paranormal for about over 20 years now, ever since I moved here to New Jersey, and I started having a lot of my own experiences in this little cabin I was renting. Everything from hearing my name called to sleep paralysis, capturing strange anomalies on video, hearing whispers in my ear. I mean, I had a lot of activity, which really spurred me to learn more. I joined a local group, and after a few years, formed my own group, North Jersey Paranormal Research, and we did many years of investigations. We've been on hold for the last few years, but I'm trying to get back into it again. I've always really enjoyed the paranormal, but I've also come to learn a lot doing shows like this and talking with so many other investigators and learning things from a spiritual standpoint that my views have changed over the years, and they're not quite in line with a lot of other paranormal investigators who usually stick to the more what I would call Victorian era spiritualism definition of ghosts and hauntings. I think there's a lot more going on in terms of interdimensional, multi-dimensional types of activity. And not everything is easily explained. In fact, there's some very high concepts in there, which we've covered in a few shows. I'm going to be talking about it in future shows. But still, Halloween is my favorite time of the year for obvious reasons. And I just love the fall. I love the whole feel of it. There is a magical element to it. And, you get all the scary movies come out this time of year. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I do not like most of the scary movies that have been coming out in the last, however many years. I prefer some of the classics, some of John Carpenter's earlier stuff, original Halloween or The Fog. Even I highly recommend, there's two old movies that really are accurate when it comes to terms of real paranormal phenomenon. One is called The Entity with Barbara Hershey, which was based on an actual case in California that Dr. Barry Taff investigated. And excellent movie. Could have used a bigger budget, but for what it was at the time, really accurate and very scary. Then there's The Changeling, not to be confused with the newer movie with Angelina Jolie. This was a movie with George C. Scott, where his family dies in a car accident. He moves into this old house in Seattle and starts encountering ghostly activity. And it's not so scary as it is more of a mystery, but some of the elements that they use in it, the haunting activity, and there's a seance scene, especially using EVP, which really wasn't heard of back then as big as it is now. So a couple of movies I highly recommend if you want a good ghost movie for Halloween, better than slasher films, better than some of these other jump scare or body horror films. These are some of the types that I really like. Around here in New Jersey, I've done a lot of investigations of big locations like the Red Mill Museum, Rolling Hills Asylum in upstate New York, Fort Mifflin down in Philadelphia, a lot of great locations. So if you visit my group's website, it's www.njpresearch.com, NJP standing for North Jersey Paranormal. So njpresearch.com, you can go click on the investigations page and see over, good Lord, I'm going to say about 15 years worth of investigations in there. So definitely check it out. We got some great evidence over the years. I've been posting some stuff on my Facebook page this last month in, celebration of Halloween. And some people don't quite agree with my analysis of certain phenomena. That's fine. Not out here to convince anybody. I'm just sharing what I got that can't be explained. Now, for things that can't be explained, I'm going to welcome our guest tonight, Craig Bryant. Now, Craig is the host of one of the podcasts here on the Paranormal UK radio network called the Paranormal Pendle Podcast. And Craig lives in the Pendle area in the UK, where the famous Pendle witches. Um, that whole historical incident happened, which is the equivalent to the Salem witch trials here in the US. And he has a couple of books. He's an author as well as a researcher, and his new book is called The Black Monks of Accrington, Unexplained Stories from Lancashire and Beyond. So I want to welcome Craig to the program. How are you doing, Craig?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me on, Mark. It's really great to see you again.
Yes, it's been a while.
Certainly has, absolutely. Yeah, life gets in the way.
Yeah, we've had a lot going on this last year or so I totally get it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, as I mentioned, you have your own show here on the Paranormal UK radio network, Paranormal Pendle Podcast. And just for those people who may not have tuned into your podcast or aware of your books, could you just tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, I live in the northwest of England, so if somebody gets a map out and has a look for the city of Manchester, and then sort of goes about 25 miles north of that, that's roughly the area that I live in. It's an area called the Ribble Valley, in a county called Lancashire. I have had an interest in the paranormal really ever since I was very young. Very small child, to be honest. My maternal grandfather was a great storyteller, and looking back now, a lot of the stories that he used to tell me were actually probably quite frightening for a young child of sort of 5, 6, 7 years of age. But I actually lapped it all up. I really enjoyed sitting there and listening to him telling me stories. Both ghost stories and stories about local legends. It's an area that is steeped in history and rich in folklore and ghost stories. And as I've done research over the years as well, quite a lot of UFO sightings in the area as well. So it's a very, very interesting place. So I've had an interest in the paranormal, as I say, really from a very early age. And probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, actually, I decided I wanted to sit down and write a book, simply because I had so many stories that I'd collected over the years, both personal stories and stories of family and friends, and also people that I'd sort of met along the way and talked to. And I was actually quite surprised at the number of people who have got their own personal paranormal stories that they were willing to talk to me about. Perhaps they hadn't spoken to other people in the past about them. They'd sort of lived with these experiences and not felt that they were able to speak to people. So I joke that perhaps I have that sort of face that people can trust. And so I managed to collect some really interesting stories. Wrote the first book, which is called The Shadow Man of Accrington, and then about a year later, 18 months later, I wrote a second book. Again, very similar in title actually, but it's because it's based around the same area, which is a town that I grew up in when I was a child. This one's called the Black Monks of Accrington, and again, it's a collection of stories from various people, local legends, local ghost stories, that sort of thing. And then, of course, I decided to start my own podcast, which is incredibly hard work when you're working full time.
Don't I know it?
Absolutely, and you have a family and you have other interests as well. And I've actually just done some filming for a documentary, which is hopefully going to be out, I believe, in spring of next year on Amazon. Again, about the paranormal. I can't really say much more about it at the moment, to be honest. But that was quite an interesting experience. Although I've obviously done quite a lot of this sort of thing in front of camera, actually doing it in front of sort of big live TV cameras, as it were, with people who are, shall we say, a little bit more professional than me when I'm doing it on this side of the camera,
Right.
was quite a daunting experience, really. But it was lovely because I met up with some fellow podcasters and fellow streamers from the northwest of England, and it was the first time, although we sort of spoken quite a lot on video and done live streams and been guests on each other's podcasts and so on. It was actually the first time that we'd all met live, if you know what I mean. So that was really quite interesting. So yeah, I've got quite a wide range of interests, anywhere from the paranormal to UFOs to local legends, folklore, cryptids, big cats, that sort of thing. There's quite a lot of that sort of activity around here as well, because it's quite a rural area where I live. Contrary to popular belief, the United Kingdom isn't just completely built up. There are massive areas of rural, farmland and woods and forests and so on. So it's a beautiful place where I live. It's very close to a very famous hill called Pendle Hill, which is synonymous with the witch trials, Pendle witch trials of 1612. So again, I'm very lucky to live in an area that is, steeped in history. And yeah, that's basically me.
The Pendle witch trials I find interesting because we've done some shows on it in the past, and for people who want to research it, there's a lot of similarities to what happened in the U.S. back in the 1600s in Salem, Massachusetts.
Absolutely,
And,
yeah.
how much of it was politically motivated, and a lot of innocent people were accused.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting actually, because I have looked into both of the cases quite well, as much as you possibly can. I mean, I don't know how much source material there is for the Salem witch trials, but we've got very limited source material really for the Pendle witch trials. Most of the source material was actually written by one person who was the clerk to the court at the assizes at Lancaster, which was the sort of local major sort of court for this area back in the 17th century. And so we've only really got his recollections of what happened. And so you have to be careful really in to sort of believe it, to believe everything that he says in the accounts, because he was quite clearly an officer of the court. He was quite clearly trying to curry favour with the authorities and had to keep on the side of the authorities. He had to make sure that the information that he wrote down justified what happened to the people who were accused of witchcraft. And interestingly as well, when he wrote his book, which was an account of the witch trials themselves and actually what happened during the court trials, he actually he dedicated the book to a gentleman called Thomas Nivert. And Thomas Nivert was actually one of the men who was responsible for the capture of Guy Fawkes. So it was a very politically motivated piece of work. So there are some definite correlations between the two cases, but I think you have to take certainly the Pendle witch trials with perhaps a little pinch of salt, really, as to some of the things which were the accused were accused of, in effect.
Yeah, and the same really happened here. Although I think there was more historical evidence regarding what happened in those cases, and it's funny because so many people here in the U.S. they get fascinated with Salem, Massachusetts. They go, "Oh, we want to go up there, experience the history." Especially anybody who's a witch or a pagan, they
Mm.
flocked up there. And I finally went up there a few years ago, and I'm looking around. I'm going, "This is it." It's all built up and new.
Yeah,
Very, very, very little historical. I mean, I'm a history nut, so I get into an area with buildings. The older, the better. I mean,
yeah.
the Gettysburg battlefield, which I live about 3.5 hours north of, at least that town has a lot of the original historical flavor to
Mm.
it. And but Salem, yeah, I was a little disappointed in that. But now, the TV shows that you mentioned, being a part of that, I've had the opportunity to be on a few shows myself, and to varying degrees of satisfaction. Let's
Mm.
put it that way. I've gotten burned a couple of times. But the American television is very cutthroat,
Mm.
and all of the paranormal shows, which right now there's a glut of them. Uh, I've been Some of the ones I did over 10, 12 years ago. And I still pop up and people will still write me and go, "Hey Mark, I just saw you on TV." And I go, "I'm sorry." Because they cut your interview up, take you out of context, change
Yeah, of
things around, and yeah.
course.
So
Yeah,
so
yeah. It'll be an interesting experience to see what the final edit looks like and what the final program looks like. So, fingers crossed that I'm not misrepresented in any way, because they did ask some quite strange questions, and there were two or three questions that I just said I've got no idea. Because I'm not the sort of person that if people ask me a question that I don't know the answer to, I'll just go off and ramble and just bowl my way through it. If I don't know the answer to a question, then I'll just say that I don't.
no, true. And well, there's a lot of new shows that or older shows that have all started to re-premiere again this time of year because this is that time of year.
It is.
And ghost stories, real ghost stories are very fascinating,
Mm.
especially when you have a credible witness or somebody who's gone through some experiences that they can't explain.
Yeah.
As I was mentioning earlier before you came on, I got into this field over 20 something years ago when I first moved to this part of the country in New Jersey, and I lived in a house that had activity, and I had all sorts of things happen to me, and it intrigued me. I did my research, called in a paranormal group, joined them, and then after a couple of years, ran my own group for many, many years. So I've had a lot of experiences over the year. I still haven't seen a full-bodied apparition yet. Haven't
Right.
seen an apparition. I've seen shadow people. I've
Yeah.
heard footsteps next to me. I've heard voices in the
Mm.
same room with me, but I still haven't had that. What do they call it? The holy grail of paranormal research, seeing that full apparition of a ghost.
Yeah, the Ghostbusters in the library type
Yeah.
apparition. Yeah, yeah. No, well, I haven't, and I've spoken to a lot of people over the years. I don't think anybody really has ever claimed to have seen an apparition in that detail. It does tend to be audible phenomena or physical phenomena. I mean, for instance, a good example would be my wife. Her family used to live in a farmhouse. It was a 16th century farmhouse, so it was dating back to the late 1500s, which it was actually one of the oldest standing farmhouses in the area. And they had a quite an interesting poltergeist who, again, none of the family ever saw anything, but they would hear things such as heavy footsteps, doors would be slammed. In fact, one interesting fact was they used to hear on the first floor, on the first floor landing, as we call it in quite sure what you call it over there, but we call it a landing in effect. So it's like the top of the stairs.
Mhm.
Used to hear footsteps, but it was sort of metal on stone. So it was like the old metal hobnail boots on stone. Now the interesting thing was that there were floorboards up on the first floor, and it was only after my stepfather-in-law, who's sadly passed away now, but he decided to take all the floorboards up in the farm simply because they had dry rot and woodworm everywhere. And they discovered that underneath the floorboards on the first floor there was the old stone flagging. So underneath, the wooden floorboards was the original stone. So that was obviously the sound that they were hearing. The old hobnail boots on the stone. But they had poltergeist activity. Sarah's grandfather, who again unfortunately passed away a few years ago, he witnessed a cut glass whiskey tumbler, sort of glass about that size, actually lift up off the sideboard and float across the room in front of him and then drop to the floor. So he witnessed that. And so those sort of things I think are quite common, but they never actually physically saw anything, but they had all these sort of audible and sort of physical poltergeist type phenomena.
I've been around people at the moment they've seen something, and it always my back is turned. I'm not facing the same direction as them. I was doing a cemetery, and it's right up in a town here called Port Jervis, which is right where the corners of Pennsylvania, New York State, and New Jersey all come together on the Delaware River. And there's this cemetery that basically the river splits around, and they have burials going back to the 1700s because it was a very old settled community. And I was with another investigator, and my battery had died in my camera, so I turned around to go get a battery, and all of a sudden I hear her cry out, and I turn around, she's literally backing up with her eyes about this big, and I go, "What's the matter?" She goes, "I just saw somebody," and it was like a man with long black hair, tan clothing, and walking across. She just saw him for like a second. He was walking, and then boom, gone.
Mm.
And made me think with the tan, she couldn't quite figure out, give me details on the clothing, but with the long black hair, and it made me think like could have been Native American because this had a very heavy Native American presence up here.
Yeah, it does sound very much like that, doesn't it? So yeah, interesting that. And also annoying that you were looking the other way and you didn't have your.
It's happened to me a few times.
Yeah.
I'm always looking the other way, and somebody else sees it. So, but what about you? What about some of your own personal experiences?
Well, I saw Shadow Man. It was the first experience that I had really. I was in my late teens, and I was working in a bar. It was a private members club actually, quite an old building built in the 1890s, and it was a club which was it was over 3 stories, 3 floors, and there was a sort of bar area on each floor. And I was working on the ground floor, the bottom floor bar. One evening, I was doing this really as a part-time job whilst I was going through college, just to earn a little bit of extra cash. And it was the middle of the week, very very quiet. It was back in the olden days where we used to stop serving alcohol in this country at about 10 o'clock 10 o'clock at night. Things have obviously changed over the years. So yeah, we're talking sort of like mid to late 80s, 1980s, and I actually saw a figure. There was a serving hatch at the end of the bar which opened up into another room, and we had big snooker tables, full size 12 by 6 foot snooker tables. So I don't know whether you have snooker tables over in the US. I know you have pool tables. So if you imagine sized up pool table, maybe, four pool tables all next to each other. That's probably about the size of a snooker table.
Okay.
And there was a serving hatch which was probably about 4 foot square, and it was waist height. And it was where people who just used to come up to the bar from the other room and get served drinks and what have you, without having to come through into the main bar area. And I was actually in the bar on my own this particular evening. It was getting pretty close to closing up time. The only other person that was actually in the building was the guy who was employed as the steward of the club. So he used to look after the club and run it from day to day. And he was up on the third floor. I think he was stocking the bar up, I think, something like that. And I sort of noticed out of the corner of my eye, there was something moving in the adjacent room, and it was moving towards the serving hatch. So as I turned to my left to look, immediately I thought it was somebody who'd come in and was trying to get a quick drink before we closed the bar up. I noticed that it was this figure which was stood in the serving hatch, and it was leaning forward through the actual serving hatch itself and leaning over into the bar area where I was stood. And it was a very tall, very thin, dark shadow. There was no facial features. There was no, I couldn't discern any clothing or anything like that. But I do remember that it seemed to be wearing a hat, and it was like a fedora type hat. It was very thin, very tall, and it was just leaning over, almost looking. If it had facial features, it would have been looking probably straight at me. And this shape, this figure, it continued to be there for probably about 10-15 seconds, and then it just disappeared. Now, it was only later that when I started doing some research before I wrote the first book, and I started doing some research into this phenomena, that I sort of realized it was what people now call a shadow man or a hat man. Sort of very typical tall, thin, slender man is another one that people sometimes refer to it. And it's a phenomena that you see. There are reports from all over the world, from going back many years. But at the time, obviously, I wasn't aware that that's what this thing was. It just seemed like a very strange apparition. I immediately thought it was a ghost of some description. So we had an internal phone system at the time. I mean, this was way before even mobile phones. And I actually picked the phone up and dialed up to the third floor where I knew the steward was. And I just said to him, I think you need to come downstairs. I've just had a really weird experience. So he said, okay, I'll be down in a minute. So he came down about 30 seconds later, and as he walked through the door, he looked at me and he said, you look like you've seen a ghost. And I said, well, strangely enough, I think I might have done. Now, bearing in mind, I'm only sort of like 18, 19 years of age. So, I'm a bit more sure of myself and a bit cockier then than I was, then than I am now. And I said, well, actually, yeah, I think I have. And he said, oh, you've seen it as well, have you? And that sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I said, what do you mean? He said, weird shape, looks like a really tall man in the snooker room, blah, blah, blah. Exactly what I'd seen. And I said, yeah, that's just what I saw. And he said, oh, plenty of people have seen it. He said, I've seen it quite a few times. He said there's been quite a few people who've worked behind the bar who've seen it at night, late on at night when they're on their own, and they've just put the coat on and left and never come back to work here again. So yeah, he said it's been seen lots and lots of times by lots and lots of people. So that was quite a strange experience, really, and it's something that's sort of stuck with me all these years.
I find the concept of shadow people fascinating because there's something about the phenomenon that's a little hard to classify. It's hard to say that, oh, you saw a ghost, because there's been other reports, there's been other types of experiences where these types of shadow people may not necessarily be ghosts in the traditional sense of somebody who's died, their spirit is hanging around. They may even have interdimensional qualities to them.
Yeah.
Uh, People have seen shadow figures during UFO experiences or abduction experiences. So what are we looking at that is pitch black, not reflecting light, has a humanoid shape, and wearing a human style hat? The hat is very, very common
Yeah.
in a lot of Shadow Man sightings. So you just kind of wonder, what is it you're looking at? Now, another similar type of phenomenon in my last show, I was talking with Neil Geddes Ward, and he's done a lot of research into like the fairy lore and around England. And could that somehow also be connected with that type of lore in terms of some types of either interdimensional or physical beings that have a tendency to come in and out of our reality or out of our perceptions, mask themselves in some way?
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, it could be. I mean, it could be a time slip. It could be, as you say, beings from a different dimension that are not quite coming all the way through, but up to a certain point where we can perceive them. And so the interesting question is, well, are they perceiving us in a similar way? Are the two of these beings somewhere in a different dimension having a discussion like we are, about people from our dimension encroaching on theirs? It's entirely possible.
well, the fact that you saw yours kind of leaning against a wall or a doorway, staring at you with the hat on, tells me that it knew exactly what it was doing, who you were. And in those types of cases, one of the things that I like to ask witnesses is, what were you feeling at the time that you saw it? Did you get any types of specific emotions other than just being startled by it? Or
Yeah, being startled, I think, is probably the best way to describe it. Although I definitely had the impression that there was an intelligence behind it, that it was aware of me in the same way that I was aware of it. And it was an intelligent um, creature, shall we say, rather than just sometimes when you get replays of ghosts and you get the same thing replaying time and time again. People obviously call it the stone tape theory. So it's a recording which is attached to a particular place or a particular um, plot of ground, shall we say, where there's been particularly heightened emotion or very emotional experience for somebody or something that is just replaying itself almost like it's stuck in time. Now those sort of things, obviously, there is no interaction. You can jump up and down and wave and shout and scream in front of one of those types of apparitions, and they're not gonna react to you because they are just a replay in time. This was completely different. This did feel like it had a consciousness, and it knew where it was. It could certainly sense me in the same way that I could sense it. But as I say, the interesting thing is, from its perspective, was it seeing me in a similar way that I was seeing it? I.e., there was no um, uh, definition. Was it seeing me as an amorphous um, blob almost of humanoid shape, but with no features, no clothing, nothing like that. But certainly the hat thing is interesting because that is the one constant. These figures seem to be of different sizes, different shapes. They do tend to be very tall and thin, but I have read reports where they've been, more sort of normal human size when it comes to, you know, limbs and body mass and shape and everything else. But the one constant is the hat, and it's the hat, I think, which is really interesting. Now, is it something that we're perceiving? I mean, are we perceiving them in that way? And you know, is our subconscious, because we now know about this phenomena, and we expect it to be wearing a hat as such, are we sort of filling in the blanks subconsciously, and that's why we see them wearing these fedora type hats? You know, it's an interesting discussion, I think.
Yeah, and I again, and I stammer because so many thoughts run through my head on what it could possibly be, and the fact that we have to acknowledge that our five senses are extremely limited
Absolutely.
compared to other creatures in the animal kingdom. Our eyesight is poor, our hearing is poor, our sense of smell is almost non-existent. So being able to sense things around us, I mean, how many times have we heard stories about animals reacting to things in an environment that we can't see?
Mm.
A cat's looking at something up on the ceiling that's not there, or dogs are
Yeah.
reacting. Even children seem to be more in tune to paranormal phenomenon than adults because they haven't been deprogrammed yet, as I
Yeah.
like to call
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And a lot of very young children seem to have experiences where they are remembering past lives, and they're having dreams about past lives. And I used to have a recurring dream when I was very young, which was quite a strange dream. I used to wake up absolutely drenched in sweat, and you know, the duvet, the sheets that were on my bed would all, but I'd obviously kick them off in you know, whilst I've been unconscious and dreaming. So they'd be on the floor, or they'd, you know, they'd be halfway across the bed or whatever. Um, and I mean, it, you know, it was something and nothing, but it was a very odd dream in the fact that I kept having this recurring dream, and it was, all it was walking down a very narrow street with the old type of cobbled stones on the street, very
it.
very tall buildings on either side, and it was raining. I remember it was raining because the floor, you know, the cobblestones were wet. And as I turned around the corner, um, there was a large factory type thing in front of me, with two very large doors that were opening outwards towards me. And behind those doors was one of the big industrial, uh, well, steel smelting crucibles, but you know, one of the absolutely huge, massive ones. And it was tipping, it was pouring, and there was all this molten metal coming out of it and flowing towards me. And then I'd wake up, and that's all the dream was. But I would have it night after night after night. I still, obviously still remember it now. Night after night after night, and wake up, and I'd be absolutely drenched in sweat, as I say, and you know, all the bedclothes were thrown off the bed, and it was you know, that I kept having that dream until I was probably about 4 or 5 years of age, and then I just stopped having it. Even though I can remember it, I just stopped having it.
The fact that you can remember it all of these years later tells me it was not a simple dream, because most dreams we forget 30 seconds after we wake up.
Yeah.
And there are those dreams that stick with you for a lifetime.
Mm.
Now, when the doors were open and you saw the molten metal being pouring, now you said it was coming towards you.
Mm.
Did I hear that
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It was it was almost like this huge crucible was sort of tipping, and it was tipping too much, and so
Hmm.
all the metal was coming out, and it was all flowing out, and it was flowing towards where I was stood. So it was almost like an accident. You know, I mean, I thought about this over the years and wondered whether it was some sort of industrial accident. Maybe it was a past life that I was remembering, and it was some sort of industrial accident, and I died in it in a past life. Because I mean, Britain was heavily industrialized, during the 18th and 19th century, and there were an awful lot, tens of thousands of people who died in industrial accidents because there wasn't, any safeguards, and it is entirely possible that in a past life, I was in that sort of environment, and perhaps I was just reliving the last moments of that lifetime and time again. Um, and yeah, I mean, you're right. Most dreams we don't remember, or if we do wake up and remember part of a dream and think, oh, that's weird, normally by the end of the day you've sort of forgotten about it and you can't recall in detail those sorts of dreams that you have. This one is extremely vivid, and even 50 years later I can still remember it.
And see, I had one in my 20s that I later realized was a past life dream. I mean, I've mentioned it on shows before, so I'll give the Reader's Digest version, but I dreamed I was in World War II in the middle of a running battle and against the Germans. And I was an American soldier. I got shot in the chest. I felt that. I felt that bullet just hit me right through the chest. There wasn't any pain, but I felt it and I dropped to the ground and I died. And it wasn't until several years later that I went to go see Saving Private Ryan. And during the Normandy scenes, not the beach storming part, but later when they were walking through the French countryside, going to go find Private Ryan, at that point, the countryside, it just brought back that dream in a big rush. And I realized I died in Normandy.
Yeah.
That was a past life where I died in Normandy. So that's a dream that's been with me over 30 years.
Yeah, yeah. It's quite a profound experience, I think, when you can find no other reason other than it's something that you've experienced in a past life, and especially when you see things that sort of jog your memory of parts of your dreams. So in your case, when you were seeing the battlefields and the countryside and everything else, and that sort of reinforced what you'd seen. I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think past life is fascinating. It's not something I'm an expert on. I do know somebody who does past life regression, and I am still building up the confidence to do it, because I do think sometimes there are certain things that you perhaps should just leave alone. But then, my inquisitive nature is, well, is there anything else that I can find out about this dream? Is there a possibility that I could go even further back, and go back to lives before that? Or is it just going to be something that my subconscious makes up because that's what my subconscious is being manipulated to do? So it is a very interesting subject.
Definitely, it's definitely something. I mean, I've done some past life regression. I had one past life that I remembered so vividly. I came up with the name, date, location. I was able to look the person up and found them, found their life, and even where they died and where they're buried. I mean, it's interesting, and my whole take on it is, if this helps quell your fear, is there's a certain amount of disassociation with it. You could sit there and say, okay, yeah, this was me in a past life. But to me, it still feels like, even though there are some memories there, that it happened to somebody else. Now I'm living this life. In some ways, past life regression could possibly help people who are maybe going through certain forms of trauma or
Mm.
phobias, and help work through it. And a good regressionist will always work with you to like look at it as an observer and not let it, if it's something of a past trauma that you're remembering, to not let it affect you now or let you feel those feelings of fear or pain or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it would really help you learn from it. So it's something to definitely explore.
Mm.
Getting back to, definitely want to get back more into the paranormal side, but we mentioned about children being more sensitive, just like animals are. There was one time I lived in a house that had some activity, and some friends came over, and they had their little boy who was also about 6 years old. And down in my basement, which was a finished basement, we were standing down there talking, and he kept pointing in the corner, and he goes, "Snow." And we go, "What?" And he goes, "There's snow." Look over the corner. It was an empty corner. There's nothing. And then it took us a minute. We realized he was trying to describe in his own way what he was seeing, which was some type of white mass.
Mm.
Um, and all he could think of is that it resembled snow, but
Mm.
there was something there. And we had several experiences in that house. So again, children can be very in tune. Some people can carry that into adulthood. I know people who are sensitive now who can go into places. Even my wife is sensitive to certain energies. We'll walk into a place and all of a sudden she feels the intense energy and she's like, "Nope, I'm out of here." Turns right around, walks out because the energy is too much for her.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I've spoken to a couple of people with regards to children who pick up on interesting um, ghosts, shall we say, or paranormal activity. Um, One lady I spoke to moved into a house. She had a daughter who was about 4 or 5 years of age at the time when she moved in. And almost immediately they moved in, her daughter would say that she was playing with a little boy, but the little boy had no legs. And she would see him in an area of the house that turns out the floor had been built up by about 18 inches. So she was actually seeing this little boy stood or moving about on the floor as it was prior to the floor being built up, which is why she could only see him from the sort of waist downwards. So she couldn't see his legs, which is why she said, he didn't have any legs. And in fact, the lady who told me this, shortly after, and this is interesting, shortly after she told me the story, she actually called me about 2 or 3 weeks later and said, "I've actually seen him now for the first time."
Hmm.
So it was almost as if there was something by her telling me about it, something almost changed in order for her to be able to see this little boy. And she said it was really interesting because he was obviously wearing um, Victorian clothing. She recognised what he was wearing from seeing photographs and pictures of similar types of clothing. Um, and so yeah, she used to see him quite regular, and he used to sing as well. She could hear him singing usually in the morning. Um, so which is quite audible phenomena, quite rare. But similar. There's a very old building very close to where I live, in the village where I live. And again, I've spoken to a lady whose daughter, again, used to see a little girl running around in this building. And she used to wave to her, and she said she'd wave back to her. But she said that she wouldn't play with her. She just kept running past her and laughing and giggling, but she wouldn't play with her. So I thought that was quite interesting. but I know of other people who've been in that building and they've heard footsteps running around, sort of like, like a child's footsteps. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Now, with all the stories that you've collected or the research you've done, one thing I've always found interesting about paranormal phenomenon, and in terms of, we'll just stick with the traditional definition of ghosts. And I find it interesting, I always found it interesting that most ghosts really, in the grand scheme of things, don't appear to be that old. Most ghosts that people encounter, even in older locations, could be within a couple hundred years old, a few hundred years old. But when you're in a location that has been occupied for, say, thousands of years, like Great Britain and Europe, and even in the US with the Native American populations, you would think that if ghosts were that prevalent, that you'd be dealing with, a 2,000-year-old ghost floating around. And while there are some stories that seem to reinforce that, most, I would say 99% of the time, it's always something that's relatively recent. Other than, say, there's a famous one, Irene used to tell me about this one, I'm sure you're familiar with it, about there's a certain road where people see no, I don't forget what you would call it, a group of Roman soldiers.
Yeah, Roman legionnaires.
Yeah, marching along the road, but yet the road comes up to their knees. Like the road itself has risen over time, and they're walking where the old road used to be, which again would perfectly go along with the stone tape theory of a recording playing over and over and not being a true ghost.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the age of some spirits?
It's a really interesting question, to be honest. I wonder whether over time the whatever energy, whatever psychic energy there is, which allows us to be able to see whether it's a replay. I mean, obviously there are different types of ghosts. I mean, if we're talking about replays, for instance, so you sort of Roman legionnaires, which, I've heard stories about that. I've heard stories about battles, even, for instance, the Battle of Hastings, for instance, some people have said that they've seen, I mean, that's going back obviously 1,000 years. Some people have seen, apparitions that they would attribute to the Battle of Hastings because it's in the area where we believe the battle took place. Roman legionnaires, especially in places, very old cities like York and Chester, for instance. There have been quite a number of sightings, and obviously on sites of old Roman roads as well, because the Romans did build, quite a massive, quite well established road system, and some of the roads still, in fact, there's a remnants of a stretch of a Roman road, literally about half a mile away from where I'm talking to you now, because there was a quite a big Roman settlement actually about 6 or 7 miles away on the river. So yeah, I wonder whether as time goes on, the energy which these type of replay ghosts are giving off, in order for us to be able to see them, perhaps becomes more diminished over time, and it's just particularly certain places, certain events. So, for instance, battles, for instance, or large groups of people, like, say, for instance, a Roman legion, marching from one place to another, that perhaps gets ambushed, and there are a lot of people killed at the same time, which obviously releases a lot of energy, as opposed to just sort of maybe individual ghosts or individual people who maybe died unexpectedly and release that energy. If you multiply that by 1,000 people or 2,000 people, obviously there's more energy being released, and so perhaps they last longer, they linger around longer. Whereas if you've got somebody who sadly has died in very unfortunate circumstances, perhaps the energy they give off maybe only stays around for a few hundred years, and that's why you don't tend to see as many ghosts of Vikings running around, or ghosts of dinosaurs running around, or ghosts of 1,000-year-old Roman soldiers, 2,000-year-old Roman soldiers even. So perhaps that's the reason for that. I mean, obviously poltergeists are something completely different. You're talking about entities that feed off energy that's being given off now. The great theory is that poltergeists are attracted to certainly adolescent females more than adolescent males, but there have been times where that has been the case. So poltergeists obviously are more of the here and now, because they're feeding off energy here and now rather than residual energy from years ago.
And that's if you think of poltergeist as being a separate spirit or entity. Where I remember there were some studies from years ago that was leading, one conclusion was that in some of these poltergeist cases, it was actually the teenagers themselves, because of their own psychic energy and going through puberty and all the hormones running through their bodies and the emotions running through their bodies, that if they had that type of energy within them, it's spiking out, causing objects to move or lights to flicker, TVs to turn on and off. So
one of the, sorry to interrupt you there, but yeah, you're right. One of the most famous poltergeist cases in this country, in the United Kingdom, was the Enfield poltergeist case, and there was certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that it was the two teenage girls that were involved who were actually causing a lot of the phenomena, rather than it actually being something which had been brought in. Although, having said that, there was also quite a bit of evidence to suggest that that's actually what was happening. So it was sort of a lot of the things that were happening you could possibly explain away, but also on the other side of the coin, a lot of the things that were happening in that case were quite difficult to explain away. So I think that was sort of six of one and half a dozen of the other. But there have been, I mean, you've had your own cases over there in the States, haven't you? I mean, the Bell Witch, I think, was probably one of the most famous ones, and certainly one that I've read about, which really quite scared me, really. Because it was quite an extreme case, I think, that family went through. So yeah, I mean, I'm living with a teenage son at the minute, so I can quite categorically state that he is giving off some sort of energy. Might not necessarily be positive, or but yeah, he's definitely hard work.
Totally understand it. I have a 14-year-old niece, and it's like, oh boy. I pity your mother sometimes. Now, there's a phenomenon that here in the States, thanks to too many of these TV shows, everybody who experiences something, so many people think, oh my God, I'm dealing with demonic activity, or it's a demon. Everybody jumps on the demon bandwagon over here. I personally don't believe in so-called demons. Now, that's not to say that there aren't darker entities or mischievous entities. I've dealt with cases that I think had some malevolence to them, but would I call it demonic? Not particularly. But still, there are a lot of stories where people have dealt with some horrific experiences. And I was wondering if in your research or even your own experiences, if you dealt with something that you consider to be on the more negative side.
Um, Personally, no, but I have spoken to people who have. But you see, I would tend to call it more poltergeist activity more than demonic. Although, you know, at the end of the day, what's in a word? If somebody is religious, and they feel that whatever's happening to them is being caused by, you know, an agent of the devil, for instance, if they believe in, you know, God and the devil, heaven and hell, who am I to say that their interpretation of what's happening to them is not right? You know, I've spoken to people who've witnessed poltergeist activity, which has been really violent, so slamming doors to such a degree that the door casing has broken. The door has been slammed that hard. Knives have been thrown across rooms at people. Objects have been thrown. You know, there's been really loud noises, which and you know, happening on a regular occurrence, really to sort of, you know, mentally attack somebody. So, you know, by sleep deprivation, for instance, and all this would tend to suggest that there is a malevolent intelligence behind what's going on. And if somebody wants to say that that's demonic, if they believe it's demonic, then, you know, I would not disagree with them. My own interpretation of that may be different, and I think it's quite easy to label something like that in a religious frame. Now, you've got to bear in mind that I've got to be very careful where I go with this, because I am not a religious person, but I understand that a lot of people have faith, and they live by that faith, and that faith is very important to them. And when something malevolent like this comes into the life, I can quite understand how they can label it in that sense, because that's how they perceive it. And I think in general, I think, you know, in this country, we are not a particularly religious country anymore. I mean, we used to be, obviously. You know, I know very few people who practice religion, to be quite honest with you. Whereas I think in your country, I think religion is a lot more important to people. And I think, you know, there are communities that grow up around belief in religion. And I think that's possibly why you perhaps have more instances of people believing that there's demonic intervention going on, rather than perhaps we would in the United Kingdom, simply because I don't think we're a particularly religious society anymore. Now, if you went back 100 years in this country, you know, to my grandparents' time, for instance, you know, they were brought up to be very religious, and you know, be staunch churchgoers, and everything that goes with it. But I just think that our society here is probably not quite as religious as other societies, and so that I think is where the religious aspects of this demonic possession and demonic intervention and everything else is probably a little bit different to how I and others would sort of view those sort of things.
And see, I'm similar to you in that I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. But I look at things from a very high spiritual level. And I look at various different types of activity and phenomenon from multiple different angles. And there's a lot of these cases that would be, some people would say would be demonic, where people are under oppression. There's the heavy poltergeist like activity, and people are being frightened, and people's personalities are changing and being taken over. But in those cases, I personally feel what you're dealing with is something which would be considered an inhuman spirit. Now, is that calling it a demon? No, not something from the devil or hell or anything like that, but some type of. In a lot of cases, I look at these as being what I would call a paranormal parasite,
Mm,
in that these types of parasites feed on energy, and the darker ones or the ones that lean more towards the negative, what do they feed off of? Negative energy. How do you create negative energy? By instilling fear in people, and by doing things that makes people unsettled. Their own personal energy is thrown out of whack through fear, through anxiety, through depression. And the more that entity feeds off of that, the more the person starts to become unhinged, or, really is getting pushed to the edge. Now, some religious people say that, well, it's a demon. Their whole goal is to possess somebody until they die, which never fully understood, except if it's let's say it's one of these parasite entities, and maybe it does weaken a person to a point where it could possess them. Do I think its end goals to ultimately kill somebody? No, because then you're killing the food source. But
mm,
sometimes somebody will commit suicide, or there will be a death, or a medical condition, because of the amount of stress. And when that body is gone, it moves on to the next one. It's like a mosquito or a leech or something. It's looking for its next food source
yeah.
because that's what it thrives on. Now, does that make it evil? I'm going to say something controversial. I'm going to say no.
Mm,
I'm going to say, is the a lion evil for eating the gazelle? The gazelle might think so,
mm,
but the lion is doing what it was meant to do. And I
mm.
think in a lot of cases, when you're dealing with some of these types of entities, that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, yes, they're bad and they can cause a lot of harm and trouble in someone's life, but I look at the terms of good and evil very differently than a lot of other people, because a lot of it's subjective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably Hollywood has got a lot to do with it as well. Obviously, a lot of the sort of historically successful films have all portrayed demonic possession. I think in some form. A lot of the horror films that people remember, The Exorcist and Poltergeist, and those sort of films. Um, so yeah, I think you're right. I think it's possibly just a natural type of phenomena that is probably one which is more of a user, more of uh, something which is as you described it, a leech. That sort of thing. A parasite is the word I was looking for, rather than just um, a poltergeist type entity which is brought in. It's attracted to somebody because of the energy they're giving off, but it doesn't necessarily, sort of take over that person's personality um, in the same way that these in inverted commas demons do.
I think there's also some times where you can deal with a human spirit, someone who died, and maybe they weren't very nice in real life. Let's face it, there are jerks everywhere,
Mm,
or bad people. Bad people can become bad ghosts, bad spirits, if their personalities continue, if they haven't evolved or fully crossed over. And in some of those cases, they may be trying to live vicariously through another person
mm,
that may be in the home, somebody who's very sensitive, or somebody maybe going through some type of trauma that allows them to be open, that this spirit can come in and take advantage of it. So in some cases, you may be dealing with a human spirit that is affecting someone, and trying to affect their personality, trying to even partially possess them because they're trying to live their life again.
yeah, absolutely. And perhaps they don't even know that they should, you know, that they have died. You know, perhaps they're frustrated because they don't quite know what's going on. They're obviously in a different place to where they expect to be, but they don't realise that they've died, and so they're just, you know, basically attaching themselves to anybody that they can, in order to try and I don't know, maybe work out exactly what's going on to them, you know. So maybe there's a fair amount of frustration going on as well, which is why they act in the way that they do.
Now, with your books, what can you mention a couple of the stories that really intrigued you that you heard from other people or researched?
Yeah, there was a very interesting story that I heard about. The second book's called The Black Monks of Accrington. So there's quite a lot of ghost sightings around some black monks that used to inhabit an abbey, which was burnt down actually in the 12th century. So it goes back an awful long way. It's in the town of Accrington, which is fairly close to where I live now, but it's the town that I grew up in. It's a very industrial town, but obviously, you know, going back to the 12th century, it was quite a rural area, and there was an abbey which was built, and it unfortunately it burnt down, and there were a number of casualties with the monks who lived there. And ever since, there have been sightings of various different ghostly apparitions in the area. I was contacted, actually. I mean, it's a story which is very well known in the area, but I was contacted by quite a few people through social media and also through my website, who'd actually had sightings of these ghostly monks themselves. They'd seen the figures, you know, wearing hooded cowls, just basically, you know, out in the middle of nowhere, in effect. Sort of, you know, I mean, one for instance was a guy who contacted me. He'd seen this hooded figure had appeared in front of him whilst he was walking down a disused railway line, which is in the area where this monastery had once stood. And he described, you know, what this figure was wearing, what it looked like, what it you know, how it acted towards him, and so on. And there's also been similar sightings, strangely enough, in a police station, an old abandoned police station, which is actually built again very close to the site of where this monastery was. There's been over the years, there have been numerous sightings again of hooded monk-like figures that have been seen in this building, and it's been the subject of quite a number of paranormal investigations over the years. And I was contacted by one paranormal investigator who'd done quite a lot of research and had seen these hooded figures, and there've been various other paranormal incidents that happened as well. So, you know, sort of the usual noises and knockings and footsteps and all that sort of thing. And then another really interesting one actually is one which is quite close to where I live now at the moment. Probably about, I would say, about 10 minutes walk from where I live is a river, and across that river there is a stone road bridge which was built in about 1830. Now, prior to that, there was a wooden footbridge which used to cross the river. It's quite a wide river, and there was a wooden footbridge there which people used to use, obviously, to get from one side of the river to the other. So on the side of the river that I live is a village, and on the other side of the river is also a village, and people obviously used to cross from one to the other. I was talking to one of my neighbours actually, whose uncle told him a story back from the it's going back about 40 years now, where he was actually down on the river fishing one morning, very early one morning. It was in the summer, and he said it was about 5 o'clock in the morning, so the sun was just coming up. It was just getting light, and he was fishing very close to where the Stone Road Bridge is now, and he noticed that there was a lady and a young girl walking across the fields towards him, and he thought it was quite strange because he knew there wasn't a footpath along these fields. They were just fields where, you know, sheep and cows, cattle graze, because it's quite a rural area around here. And he said that as these two figures got closer to him, he noticed that strangely they were both dressed in from head to foot in white. The lady in particular had a sort of long flowing white dress on. The little girl had similar sort of garb. He thought at the time that they looked quite old fashioned. He thought they looked out of time. And it was only afterwards really that he sort of thought that they were, you know, very early Victorian, sort of late 1700s, early 1800s. And he said as he was watching these two figures come towards him, they actually walked towards him, towards the bank of the river. And then instead of stopping at the edge of the river, they just carried on in thin air, carried on walking in thin air across the river, crossed the river onto the other side of the bank, and then just disappeared into the distance. And it was only afterwards that he realised that where they were actually crossing the river is where the old footbridge used to be. So I thought that was quite interesting. So I've obviously, you know, I've been down there quite a lot and looked at the area and taken photographs and found old black and white photographs of where the footbridge used to be, and you can see exactly where the road bridge is now, the stone footbridge is now, and where the old wooden footbridge used to be. So yeah, that was quite interesting. It's always nice to get sort of stories like that which are really local, you know, within you know, sort of 5 minutes walk, you know, somewhere you can go and have a look yourself. So yeah, they're interesting. Plenty of stories in both books. You know, there's some really really interesting ones. There's an interesting one about a murder and a seance that was done, and an investigation with a particularly physical poltergeist who pushed one of the investigators down some stairs in this shop actually that they were investigating. And as I say, it turns out there was back in the 1890s there was a murder of a woman in there, and this entity you know, claimed to have been responsible. So yeah, lots of different stories, lots of haunted pubs, lots of haunted inns, you know, the classic old-fashioned haunted inns that we have over here. So yeah, lots of really interesting stories.
What would you say would be the most famous incident or location that you've personally investigated?
Investigate and visit, I think, are probably two different things. I don't tend to do many investigations. I investigated a school, which was really interesting. That's in the first book, and there's some really quite interesting phenomena in that. But I've visited quite a lot of very well-known haunted locations in the area. We have quite a lot of old family buildings, so the landowners you know, built huge halls that they lived in, and we've got quite a lot of those dating back to sort of like the 11th, 12th, 13th century, when we had that sort of feudal peasant system, you know, farming system. There's one which is quite close by called Samlesbury Hall, which is famous for having the ghost of a white lady who is often seen. There's a road which goes past the building now, and she's often seen floating across the road, and motorists have on many occasion slammed the brakes on, come to a halt in the cars, thinking that they've actually hit somebody who's walked out in front of them. Of course, when they get out of the car and look behind them, there's nothing there. She's a lady called Dorothy de Southworth. She dates back to about the 14th century. So she's quite a well-known ghost, and I'm quite lucky in that I could go into places like this where there is a lot of history and there's a lot of paranormal activity. And you mentioned that your wife's quite sensitive to these sort of things. I'm similar in that respect. I can pick up on a lot of energies. My wife is very similar as well. She can pick up on different things to me. She's been known to go into places and pick up on names and dates and that sort of thing. So we're quite fortunate in that respect. I'm not your sort of archetypal investigator, really. I don't go into somewhere armed with armfuls of electronic equipment, because I don't believe that that's necessary. I think really if you're going to go into somewhere, then you just use your senses, what you see, what you hear, what you feel. Sometimes you perhaps have that sixth sense that you don't use day to day, but when you do go into these places, you can pick up on that sort of energy that perhaps is there. So yeah, I've been quite lucky in that respect, and as I say, we've got a lot of history. We've got a lot of really interesting places around here that you can explore and visit and sort of make your own mind up really about the stories and the legends that go with them.
Now I know we're coming up here towards the end, but one thing I wanted to mention or ask you about is because you did mention, your interest in not only cryptid-like creatures, but UFOs, and we could do whole shows on those.
We
But
could.
yeah, the
and we can. I haven't got a problem with that at all.
okay. Oh, we'll have to have you back, and we'll do one of those. But I will ask, have you encountered a story where you have overlapping phenomenon? So let's say, for example, somebody who's experiencing ghost or poltergeist like activity at the same time that they're experiencing possibly like UFO type of activity.
Not so much that. I have come across quite a bit of UFO activity and cryptid activity as well, and a lot of animal mutilation. So we've been getting quite a lot of animal mutilation cases over here over the last few years. And there's an area, there's a town fairly close by called Todmorden, which is very well known for UFO activity. It's where there was a very famous case in the early 1980s, a police officer by the name of Alan Godfrey. If your listeners are not familiar with it, if they just use any search engine, I would say the G word, but other search engines are available, and just put Alan Godfrey UFO or Alan Godfrey abduction into it, you will get the story, and it's a very famous story, that people have been investigating for years. He's a very interesting guy. He's written a book on it, but that area is also there are a lot of instances of cryptid sightings. There's a lot of instances of big cat sightings. There are animal mutilation cases, and these animal mutilation cases are very similar to the ones that you get all around the world, where you've got wounds or incisions that are made in these animals that are precise. They are almost medical, in nature. There is definitely some correlation between them and UFO activity. There've been a number of UFO sightings in the area, in that particular area, going back many years, and across the wider area of the northwest of England as well. So although I do believe that there is some correlation between paranormal activity and UFOs, I think there is something which is bringing the energy in, if you like. So it's, we can talk about ley lines, we can talk about water, the energy that runs through water. They all have geology as well, the geology of an area. They all have bearings, I think, on concentrating different types of energy, which can bring in more UFO activity, can bring in more paranormal activity, and can also be centers of cryptozoology mysteries, with regards to animal mutilations and that sort of thing as well. So I've got absolutely no doubt that there isn't a correlation between the two. I've yet to actually speak to anybody who sort of gives me that definitive evidence to suggest that that is the case.
Okay. Well, we have come up here on towards the end of the show. So your book is the new book that just came out in March of this year, The Black Monks of Accrington, Unexplained Stories from Lancashire and Beyond. Where can people find your book?
Well, the best place to find it is on Amazon. I do have a website which has got links to both the books. My website is craigbryant.co.uk, so it's quite easy to find. And there's also a link there as well to the podcast as well, and various other sites of interest, and little snippets of investigations that I'm doing and that sort of thing. But yeah, the website or Amazon, best place really to find that work.
Fantastic. Well, Craig, thank you very much for coming on the program. And yeah, we're definitely going to have to do this again and talk about some of these other topics. I think we'll have a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. And thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. And that was Craig Bryant, author of Black Monks of Accrington, Unexplained Stories from Lancashire and Beyond. I want to thank him for joining us, and I want to thank you for tuning in to another edition of the Astral Perception Show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Again, we air bi-weekly for the most part. I aired my last episode a little early this last time, so we've had a 3-week break. But I've got shows booked to the end of the year going into January, so we will be continuing every couple of weeks with a break around Christmas time. So please feel free to tune in on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, which is available on pretty much all podcast platforms: Apple, Spreaker, iTunes, well, Apple. And we also have the streaming radio station on the Paranormal Radio app and TalkStream Live. So definitely check us out. And I have, of course, my YouTube channel, which has the video portion of this, all of my interviews, including this one. So again, thank you, everybody. Happy Halloween. Be safe out there, and we will catch you all next time. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye.